Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes. But you just need to share your screen now.
I'm going to. Never done this
Unless
before.
this is the presentation you bobbing your head.
I have never done something like this before. Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm going to jump straight in. If there are any problems with the presentation, I'm not going to see what you guys are saying. So I will rely on Iggy to what's happening, and hopefully I can make some kind of a plan. Like if I'm too close to the screen, and if that's a problem. I wonder if anybody knows what movie this image is from. It is The Truman Show. And I'll come back to it. Its relevance will emerge. There are two parts to this talk. Both are about complexity and how we respond to it. The first, complexity is essentially about this thing of coming to understand things, or not being able to understand them, understanding things as the case may be because of complexity. So complexity applies to our understanding of the world beyond us, but it also applies within us, the human experience of what it means to be in a condition or a state of complexity. And it's a distinguishing feature of our time. One could argue more or less since Nietzsche declared that God is dead. The second part of the talk is about politics and liberalism. To be liberal is to be a questioning person and to be open-minded and to let new ideas in and to seek new ideas. Politically, it means being allowed to do those things and to act upon them, obviously within agreed limits. But that very way of being invites complexity. And there are issues with that, which I want to talk about too. All right, going on. I just had to burp. All right, wicked problems are essentially the kind of poster child of complexity, and originally formulated in the theory of design by Rittel and Weber in 1973. But the really, in my opinion, the seminal paper that speaks to the impact of wicked problems and complexity on design is a paper by Richard Buchanan in 1992 called Wicked Problems in Design. I'm going to quote that a lot. The first thing to say, though, is that we need to distinguish between wicked problems as a type of problem and wicked problems as a quality of complexity that can be found in problems. So wicked problems as a type of problem are things like global climate change, natural hazards, healthcare, the AIDS pandemic, pandemic influenza, drug trafficking, nuclear weapons, waste, social injustice, and so forth. So one thing which should be quite clear and which should resonate with most of you if you do any form of design thinking or human-centered design is that what makes the complexity a reality is that depending on what kind of or what your role is as a stakeholder in the problem ecology, the problem itself as a phenomenon is different. So I've been studying addiction for the past 3 or 4 years, trying to come up with an information architecture solution to it, which I'll come to explain. But in that ecosystem, the stakeholders are, they are so diverse. So firstly, there's the addict. Then there is the family system. Then you've got community systems, workplace, health systems, supply systems, which include both illegal, so your dealers, but also pharmacies. You've got your political and legal systems, criminal justice systems, education systems, and so on. In this diagram, the purple thing purple dot which says UAC. They were my clients on the project. So addiction as a problem for a policeman manifests totally differently as a problem for a teacher, or for a community leader, or for your boss at work, right? And it is this reconciliation, or the struggle to reconcile that manifests as a complexity. Looking at addiction, a really interesting take on it was offered by probably the most interesting take on addiction, with all my bias included, because he is a South African. Guy Duplessis describes addiction as a multiple object ontology within a continuum of complexity. So what this means, I try to draw a picture for it, is that these different orders of complexity, first, second, third level orders, are based on the information that we can gather about reality. So first order is I'm looking at something in the world and I can do observational analysis. Second order is where I have to go to quantum levels, for example. And I now need to start inferring or deducing what is reality. And the third order is when we start looking at social reality. So the multiple subjective realities which we can only at best abductively determine a reality thereof. So now split those different orders across that stakeholder ecology I presented, and understand that police come from a world of criminology, that teachers come from a world of education, that your boss is someone from business, and people who have studied in these different areas and who are preoccupied every single day with these things see the world differently, and they have different world views. So you've got the science view, you've got a postmodern or a constructivist view, you've got a pragmatic view, which is largely the view of design, etc. And unpacking all of this stuff is extraordinarily difficult. Suffice to say that in design, we conduct research to try to understand this stuff. So the image on the left is a table which Terence and I put together to basically simplify the discussion of the design thinking process to be about inquiry, ideation, and prototyping. And we compare it to a bunch of other models and thus create an argument for that kind of simplified version. The first major impact of complexity on design is brought forth by Buchanan. Most of them are by Buchanan that I will bring up today. And it's about the shift in the object of design. So what we see, this is written 1992, right, is going from thinking about the why, which is accomplished via research, to the what, which is ideation, and the how, which is prototyping. Traditionally, without complexity, when we design, we have a handle on what the problem is. The issue becomes how best to design the website or the chair or the car or the system that, well, no, system's bad example, you know, to solve the problem. What complexity brings forth is this thing that, well, we can't know yet what we should be designing. How do we know whether a website or a chair or a car or an airplane is appropriate to the problem, because we don't know what the problem is. So we start with our research. And the focus, the object of design, becomes the ideation. That becomes of if not primary, then initial importance. Thereafter, how we execute those ideas becomes the second kind of instance of making, really. This thing of the what, we arrive at it through synthesis, right? So we go and do a whole bunch of research, and we get all these findings. We need to synthesize those findings. John Kolko, who I will introduce in a moment, explains / argues that the underlying modality of ideation and design thinking is synthesis, and that synthesis in turn is premised on sense making and abduction. Okay, so abduction being the best guess we can make on those 3 levels of complexity in order to try and have an interpretation of what reality is, and by extension what a problem might be in that reality. Sense making is the business of how we arrive at the abduction, making sense, right? Because this is not science, right? This is not about truth and fact. This is more about understanding and meaning. I wish the audience was in front of me, like literally. That guy on the left and now on the right is John Kolko, right? The guy in the middle is going to be speaking after me. That's Don Norman. The reason why I'm showing these photographs is partly because Don is going to be speaking next, but also to make the point that John Kolko is cool and information architecture is not. Look how cool he is. Okay? I mean, you do not see information architects like that. Anyway, and yet it is John Kolko who has done a lot of research and a lot of writing on the relationship between information architecture and synthesis. So the little purple bits in the image are where I've tried to show on his website, where top left, here's an article called Abductive Thinking and Sense Making, the Drivers of Design Synthesis. But below that, earlier, he was writing about information architecture and design strategy as ways to do synthesis. At the bottom, synthesis techniques for the muddy middle of design process. And you can see his interest on the top right in wicked problems, and on the bottom right, exposing the magic of design, a practitioner's guide to synthesis. And in all of these cases, although not the wicked problems, he's talking about the way that information architects are able to deal with and work with large amounts of information and make sense of it, even in examples as basic as websites. Well, big websites with like thousands of pages, which nobody builds anymore because all we do is design for mobile. Right, so maybe I should end the talk there. Anyway, that's just me being facetious. The idea that information architecture is about sense making and about understanding comes from Richard Saul Wurman. So the same guy that created the TED conferences. He's one of the fathers of information design. And it's a real shame that in the late 90s, when the information architecture for the World Wide Web came out by Lou Rosenfeld and Peter Morville, those guys were coming from a tradition of library and information design, not from Wurman's tradition, where Wurman was an architect trained under Louis Kahn. And he was interested in a much, much more designerly notion of information architecture. And this connection got severed with the library and information science, information architecture that we see today. And a fair amount has been written about that. I've written on it, Andrea Rismini. So I can validate this stuff, but something got lost along the way. And I think it's been a disservice to both design and IA, because I'm going to argue that IA and design really, really need each other. And when I say design, I don't mean UX design. I mean any design. Kolko explicitly says that the kinds of techniques, tools, thinking that is required to do good synthesis is lacking, by and large, in design education within the realms of product design. And in product design, he's including industrial design, interaction design, UX design, that whole sphere. And it's important to note that the reason why John Kolko was speaking to Don Norman there is that John Kolko is a practitioner, but he's also been teaching for a very long time. He's written books about his teaching. He started a school in Austin, Texas, where he teaches. So the guy really knows what he's talking about when he makes assertions like these. Next point, reinterpreting complexity in design number 2. Okay, so I'm quoting Richard Buchanan, that 1992 article that I mentioned up front. The wicked problems approach suggests that there is a fundamental indeterminacy in all but the most trivial of design problems. Whereas Rittel and Weber, Rittel suggests, the wickedness has already been taken out to yield determinate or analytical problems. To understand what this means, it's important to recognize that indeterminacy is quite different from undetermined. Indeterminacy implies that there are no definitive conditions or limits to design problems. What he's saying here is incredibly subtle, and it's the reason why I made the point earlier that the distinction between a wicked problem as a type of problem, like HIV and AIDS, or even addiction, versus wickedness being a quality of a problem, or a part of the nature of any problem. What is being suggested is that if we frame the problem narrowly, right, we can say, yeah, the solution to a problem is a website, or a mobile app, or a chair. But the broader we frame the potential understanding of a problem, then the more we introduce the potential for wickedness, or just wickedness, because naturally, by expanding the frame, we will start to include different stakeholders, etc. So a nice visual way of putting this, I'm sure lots of people will be aware of this image. I hope not, but I've entitled it How to Get Caught by a Fish, as opposed to How to Catch a Fish, in case you didn't get it. So this would be a narrow frame. This thing is a medium frame, right? A really large frame presents a bloody great white shark following our not fishermen. So the point I'm making here should be fairly obvious, which is the point is not to make every problem wicked, but the point is to say that if you want to be doing design seriously, or helping your clients seriously, or whatever it might be, how do you know when your frame is broad enough so that you can determine what the problem is? Because if our frame is there, there's no problem. He's looking over his shoulder because, I don't know, he heard a boat hoot, or he's just checking out the landscape. We don't know that he's looking over his shoulder because there's a bloody great white shark following me. So, you know, that this is the issue. And the point is not to overcomplicate things for the sake of it. The point is to understand what the real problem is. Right, so there's some morals. Firstly, we don't have sharks like that in Joburg, all right? You don't get that in Cape Town. Let's just put that out on the table, and it is a moral, okay? Point number 2, how do you know when you've done enough research to identify what the real problem is? I've mentioned that. But the third point, which it's actually the second point, but it's actually a third point, is that research is good. Complexity is good if you know how to synthesize it, right? If you've got those skills, if it is not something to fear. Oh my God, it's complex. Oh, that means, why are we negative about complexity? Yeah, in the design process. What is that resistance about? Is it, I don't know, what is it about? Why do we prefer the simplicity? So even Norman, agrees. He comes from a different perspective to Buchanan, but in his book, Living with Complexity, right up at the very beginning, he speaks about the unknowability of reality. But he flips it in the way that I'm suggesting that we flip it too, is that, you know, we need to think about complexity as richness, right? That it is richness that is available to us. So Don's also cool. Just, I think that needs to be said. I don't know who that guy is, but he is in cool company. So, you know, I'm sure he's a nice guy. So I kind of can't help but feel that deep down inside, designers don't actually like researching. Up until really recently. I don't think people were attracted to design because of human-centered research and things like that. And I think it's against this background of a lack of knowledge of how to synthesis or how to make, or what to make the richness with and of, that becomes a problem. And we start finding these myths like, no, you mustn't do too much research because, or what's the point of doing too much research, because you just end up in analysis paralysis. Or big research isn't necessary. Just do quality, it's enough. Or all you need is the right people around the table, right? That's a famous one of IDEOs. Also, IDEO also said big research isn't necessary. And a lot of this is being true to the problem. A lot of it is brushed under the table in terms of reframing, not actually being about reframing the problem, but about reframing the future. And by that I mean reframing always does both. But it's easy to produce a whiz bang, awesomely cool thing which addresses aspects of a problem, but not the whole problem. But, you know, in those case studies, we don't talk about that research aspect, or it's not in anybody's interest to talk about it, so it tends not to happen. So, in short, I would actually argue, with all my modesty aside, that I think design thinking is applied design thinking. It's very good at kind of sort of solving big problems in small ways. In other words, they don't always get to the big problem. Which leads us to the next problem, which is that design thinking, how the theory of it is that inquiry, ideation, and prototyping are three co-enacted things. Our brain is doing all three at the same time. But that if we linearize that into a process of inquiry, ideation, and prototyping, is that it loses its efficacy. Like it loses its ability to be good at allowing creative ideas to emerge. And both Brown and Buchanan note this. I want to add to this idea of information architecture, sense-making from Richard Saul Wurman, that on the other side, Terence and I have been writing about information architecture as meaning-making. So if sense-making represents the bit about research, meaning-making represents the bit about prototyping. And the paper on the screen, I'll put this on my site, by the way, guys, so you can read all this stuff. We published this paper in the Journal of Philosophy and Technology, and we've got fairly interesting arguments. But the essence of it is that an object, any object, from an information architecture point of view, is constituted by internally a structural logic and externally a semantic formation. The semantic formation, the structural logic, you can think of as a sitemap, right? That is the structural logic. How that structural logic manifests in the object is as a semantic formation. So your navigation is derived from that structural logic, right? You can muck with that, but it is for this precise point that the separation and severing, or saying that interaction design and information architecture are different things, has been so damaging for UX in general. You can separate them in theory. You should never separate them in practice. It's one mode of thinking. And what's happened is that information architecture has been sort of sidelined because interaction design reckons it's got it covered. The meaning making in how we synthesize different bits of information is perhaps nicely exemplified in this very atheist example of how the notion of God is created in Christianity. So the Holy Trinity is the semantic formation. the Holy Trinity being comprised of the Holy Spirit, the Son, and the Father is the structural logic. And the Gestalt whole, the thing which is greater than the sum of those three parts plus the Holy Trinity, is our notion of God. And this is literally how in information architecture meaning making can occur and does occur even if you're not consciously doing it, which is where an issue of responsibility comes in. Because information architectures go into the world as contrived ontologies. Now, again, no offense intended to Christian or other religious people watching the presentation, but if God doesn't exist, then these kinds of ideas are what we call contrived ontologies. It is a contrived idea, concept. What is God? Because that is what ontology is about, right? Whatness. What am I? What makes a cup a cup? Is described through the Holy Spirit, the Son, and the Father. And these contrived ontologies are what go into the world hidden inside products. So you've got social reality mediated by a design object, and hidden inside the design object, you've got social reality. I know I need to wrap up. So Iggy, let me just find a good spot. Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I wasn't able to finish everything to even get me a part 2. The crux of what I'm saying, I'm going to jump to it. And look at all these cool pictures which you're going to miss.
So maybe Jason,
I'll just finish the slide because it'll at least make sense, the presentation. Iggy? So just to sum up, what I'm busy arguing for at the moment is the idea that there is a role for information architecture across all forms of design, if we think of information architecture as a form of design in and of itself, where you've got sense making and meaning making, and ideation is the business of determining structural logics and semantic formations, which will end up being contrived ontologies going into the world. And I will end there. So we had some technical difficulties yesterday, being that my presentation was too long. And so now you guys get to experience the eternal return of Jason Hobbs. Other important news is I'm wearing a beanie today because my mate Vlad said I looked like a hobbit yesterday with my new curly hair. The reason for the curly hair is that I swore to myself that I wouldn't cut it until I finished my master's, which I was meant to finish a year ago. Okay, so just a quick recap from where we were yesterday. I was talking about the way we respond to complexity in design. Complexity naturally leads into the conversation of wicked problems, and I wanted to make a distinction between wicked problems being a type of problem, such as climate change or HIV and AIDS, COVID, etc., and it actually being a quality of problems. In other words, any problem can be wicked or complex, but we'll come back to that. So the first point was this shift in the object of design. So, and this was Buchanan's point, that if we don't know what the problem is, we can't assign a category of design, be it industrial design, digital design, architecture, interior design, because we don't know whether that kind of design is the right solution to the problem. This is not necessarily anything new. Probably the major response in design terms to this has been human-centered design, where the idea is that we replace in the why, what, and how, the ideation bit, the what we should do about the problem, becomes the description of the experience that you want somebody to have, right? That's kind of the essence of human-centered design in these terms. But most importantly, we see the rise of the need to do research, to do design research. And Kolko is the individual who makes the point that information architecture is really good for sense making and for being a major driver behind synthesis of the data that we get from research for ideation, and that this is lacking in education, in design education globally. Second point is that any problem can be wicked or complex. It's a matter of how broadly we frame the problem, okay, or narrowly. I put forward that there were a whole lot of unhealthy workarounds, assumptions, and myths that have arisen because people actually really don't know how to retain design's designerliness when you need to do big research. So as a result, there are these workarounds and myths, IDEO saying things like, oh, you don't need to, big research, you don't need to do. And I'm not advocating big research. I'm advocating appropriate research. So in essence, what we want to do is turn the negative of wickedness or complexity on its head. We want to turn it into a positive, which is Don Norman's point in his book about complexity, which is that we want to understand complexity as richness, and that what we can get from this deep immersion into reality is a richness of understanding. What is critical, regardless, is that you still need the skills to synthesize. The last point that I made, in a bit of a rush, was that design thinking, or designs thinking, doesn't like to be linearized. So the inquiry, ideation, prototyping type model is actually a co-enacted modality of thinking. So we are ideating, we are prototyping, we are thinking about the now and the future all at the same time in a big kind of jumble. When you try to linearize that, the magic which exists in that muddy middle, as Kolko refers to it, is lost or can be lost. And what we end up doing is we end up being structural, analytical, etc., and we lose the spark, the creativity. But it also explains why, if any of you have been involved in kind of digital transformation projects, you'll be consulting to or working within a large enterprise organization, and inevitably the guys from Frog, or the guys from IDEO, or the guys from wherever arrive to do their 1 week, 2 week interventions, and honestly, I've seen this more times than I have toes, and I just don't believe it, and I don't care if you're from IDEO, and you've got a big name and a big head. When you're working on like really big design-led enterprise digital transformation projects, for example, you can't solve this stuff in 2 weeks, or even a lot of 2 weeks. You need something which can be structural, but still retain the creative essence of designs thinking. So I've spoken about, up until this point, information architecture as or just putting it down. I haven't. There's not time in this talk to explain the how. I'm just saying what the proposition is. The first bit is that information architecture can help with sense making between inquiry and ideation. But then there's the other side of it, right, which is information architecture's meaning making. And I briefly discussed that the way meaning is made is through how we organize information, right? So there's one aspect to it which is structural logic, and the other is semantic formation. Semantic formation is the shape that the structural logic takes. So in the diagram on the screen in front of you, the little number 1, or the I, the Roman one, on the dark side of the moon, sustains the dotted line of the semantic formation. Because when people interact with any designed or even any artificial object, they only experience the semantic formation. They don't experience the structural logic in a observational sense, unless you're trained to see the structural logic behind things. Right? Most people don't see that. And I gave the example of God, and I used this example specifically, and with no intention to offend. The point here is that I wanted to use an example that had nothing to do with digital, and it's the last thing that we would think of as being designed or having been designed, right? But the idea that the Holy Trinity is the semantic formation. The structural logic of the Holy Trinity is that it is made up of the Son, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, but that the thing which comes into the meaning, which goes into the world, is God, right? And that Terence and I refer to as contrived ontology. And when I say contrived, I don't. It's not intended with the negative connotation with lots of people have. It's more because ontology, or the ontology of a thing, what something is, its whatness, is an emergent property. It's something which emerges through people's interaction with the world. And this is exactly what design does do and does not do. All design has a contrived ontology. Anything artificially made by humans and put into the world has a contrived ontology. The real kicker is whether or not we are paying attention to that. And one might argue that human-centered design is all about that. And I would say it falls short in a variety of ways, but by and large, it's pretty good. Human-centered design is a good thing. The important point here is that new meaning can be considered to be the thing which is used to mediate reality. In other words, to make bad things good, or to make a horrible experience a good experience, etc., etc. And it is this kind of hidden, contrived ontology that enters the world. The theme in this presentation was abundance and scarcity, and there's a point that seems to be missed in Buchanan's discussion of wicked problems in design, and that his whole point, bearing in mind this was written in '92, is that our imaginations of how to solve, there is a limit to put on our imaginations in terms of how to solve problems when we approach the problems from a particular design category. For example, as an architect, or as a UX designer, or as an industrial designer, we bring the history of that category and all those assumptions with that. That is called assumptive design. In a problem-led approach, which is how you need to approach complexity, for all of the issues that brings with it, some of which have been solved or addressed to a point, the important thing that he's saying is that we are free, right? The limit of our imagination becomes the thing which is available to us. And this is why we really want to learn to understand how to work with complexity and not sidestep it and not try to aim for simplicity. In understanding the problem, you can aim for simplicity in the experience, but simplicity in understanding is a different thing, okay? So my work over the past 3 or 4 years, looking at addiction, doing my master's through UJ, I am a mature student, apparently. Is putting forward this idea of another type of IA called conceptual information architecture. And it is how you come up with ideas in ideation at scale in complexity, right? In short, and to use big words, it is re-ontologizing a problem. It's saying the problem is the problem, and the whatness, the ontology of the problem, is of a specific nature. But what if we change that whatness by restructuring it and then use that as the means to ideate further and bring new experiences and products and services and things into the world? Conceptual IA, Conceptual IA is not saying this is going to replace other forms of information architecture. It is a new type, right? It is complementary to the other forms of information architecture that we find. For example, library and information science type IA for websites, although I think that needs to be replaced. And more importantly, pervasive information architecture, right? Which is the service design level of information architecture written about by Andrea Resmini and Luca Rizzotti. So the point here is the design process, which we typically see. This is from IDEO's Human-Centered Design Toolkit in the introduction. And it suggests that we go through, they use here, I say inquiry, they say create, I say ideation, they say deliver, I say prototype. And there's this movement from concrete to the bottom to abstract at the top, and the journey is going through that. But there's an implication here, or there's an assumption that this is a one-size-fits-all, that this can work for simple problems as well as medium-sized problems or large-sized problems. And the point is not that there's anything wrong with IDEO. The point is that we lack something in design which allows us to differentiate between big, medium, or small problems. In architecture, they've got they use something called scale ratio. So scale ratio is the size of the model of what you are representing about reality in relation to reality. So a one-to-one model is a model of a cup exactly the same size as the cup. But if I'm doing, if I'm designing a house and I want to create a model of the house or a maquette, I will make it 1 to 10,000. Or if I'm an urban planner, I'm way up high and I'm viewing huge amounts. And so my scale ratio, when I try to represent that in maps and so forth might be 1 to 100,000. And you'll notice that in architecture that there are different forms of design that address problems at different moments. So you've got urban planning, town planning, architecture, interior architecture, all the way down to interior design, etc. So that kind of paints the picture. But we, in design in general, and particularly with regards to forms of design that emerge from the theory of design thinking, this Buchanan's interpretation of wicked problems and being problem-led, is depending on the breadth and the depth of your framing of the problem, right, which informs your research, it informs to what extent the DT process will be elongated. And as I've said, the design thinking process doesn't like to be elongated. And the example I gave of oversimplifying was, how do we know when we've actually, identified what the real problem is? So we can spend a year redesigning online banking for some company, and it makes no difference because actually, at the end of the day, the issue is pricing. Yeah? So that's just an example. So I chucked in IDEO's model there just for the point, just to make a point, that is there a small version of this and is there a bigger version of this? And so in my master's, in my thesis, I introduced the concept of frame scale, which is a ripoff of scale ratio. And in this picture, which I think is absolutely beautiful and is like the South African Highveld, let's say that picture is the totality of reality, right? Depending on the breadth and depth of frame will tell me how much of reality I'm looking at, right? So that's the shark and the canoer example. So what we find here is in a narrow and a shallow framing of a problem, we see the 3 circles in there, and those 3 circles are saying it's all good. our design thinking, our designerly ways of thinking are being able to be enacted comfortably. But as frame scale increases, we start to see a progressive linearizing. So we can know more about reality, but it becomes harder to be creative in solving the problems for it. Or the quality of the problems, the quality of the solutions that we come up with to solve the problem become less designerly. All the way through to, okay, well, if we really want to solve this big problem in this big way, then the process is radically linearized. So the primary proposition that I'm building for this new type of information architecture is that it can help in retaining synthetic integrity at scale. And synthetic integrity means a whole bunch of things, but suffice to say, it means that we can sustain that synthetic modality where those three different ways of thinking coexist across time and across teams and across geographies. We can keep that creative essence if we know how to do information architecture creatively as a form of design in and of itself. I can't go into this, unfortunately, but here is the essence. Inquiry, ideation, prototyping. The two propositions of information architecture, of sense-making and meaning-making, occur on either side of that. And they cast a net. And so they allow for a scaling up and a scaling down in that kind of idea model, where sense-making is enriched and meaning-making is enriched as we move from concrete to abstract to concrete. And the thing which binds it all is this idea of conceptual information architecture, which provides a contrived ontology that we knowingly and carefully craft all the way through into, you know, our resultant design products. And that contrived ontology becomes our design strategy, not just for the execution of the design process, but the design strategy for the solution in the world. Because from there, we can continue to iterate and change and improve and measure and get feedback and carry on integrating and working with customers and users through the process of co-designing. The aim here is to allow for the natural abundance to be found in the act of designing, that being the limitless abundance of the imagination, to be sustained and maintained. And I think this is something that's missing in the world, and I think it might be quite useful to designers, and most importantly, I think design education. Again, the point is not that we should be doing big design all the time. The point is that if we need to, we know how to, and that we can pull back. So if we know how to do the big stuff, it means that you do the small stuff even better. And you get a kind of a creative dexterity. You know that you can go in different directions and what the implications are. And I think it's essential if we even want to be talking about junior, mid, or senior levels of design ability, is the capability to actually work across these different levels. So, the lack of skills in IA create a certain kind of scarcity. However, information architecture does not do itself any favors because of the scienciness of library science information architecture. And the theory doesn't exist for what I'm talking about. So I'm in the process of writing this theory and collaborating with other people around the world on building out an argument for something called information architecture design. And if you want to follow my work on this, you can follow me on ResearchGate. I've got a project up there called the Information Architecture of Addiction, where you can find, I don't know, hopefully it'll be in the next month or so. I'll put the thesis up there and all the examples of the work that I did on the project. So it'll be real tangible design deliverable stuff. Very quickly, there's another form of scarcity which is existing in the world, which is much more worrying to me than information architecture. it is the scarcity that is created by capitalism and by neoliberal free markets, consumerist-based logics. I don't have a problem with capitalism. I've got a real problem with greed. Watch this. So if you haven't seen this film, The Truman Show, this guy, Truman, was born into a reality TV show. And this is the moment at the end of the film where he comes to realize that what he thought was reality is not reality, that it's just a TV show, and that he can break out of it. And this is what I mean when I talk about scarcity and abundance and the limits of the imagination. The web of today has been so commercialized. When I started doing this 20 years ago, it wasn't about marketing. It wasn't, well, it wasn't only about marketing. It wasn't about commodification. It wasn't about Google and Facebook and Instagram and all the rest of them owning all of my information. My first job was with a bunch of crazy research and development dudes in observatory in Cape Town. And they were working, 20 years ago, they were working in Perl and Python and espousing open source and open access. Creative Commons came soon after. And all of these things are premised in the idea that the nature of the technology of the internet and the World Wide Web is about sharing, right? And capitalism is about owning. And what we are seeing more and more is this thing of, to a capitalist, there is no boundary to what can be owned. If I've got a flag and I put it down, I can own for as far as the eye can see, for as long as I can defend that territory. And this is a form of neocolonialism. And Don Norman mentioned it yesterday. I was very impressed to hear him say that, and that the West needs to cut out these practices. And we as designers, and particularly the younger designers who've come into the field not knowing the culture of sharing that existed amongst designers and people working on the web in the late 90s, it wasn't always like this. And so when companies like IDEO, etc., talk about radical innovation, the radical innovation is right under our noses. We haven't even started scratching the surface of what open source and open access and things like that really mean for big corporates that we're dealing with. A simple example would be banking institutions opening up customers' data to customers or giving it back. Banks don't own your data. Just because it sits on their servers doesn't mean they own it. You should be able to get downloads of all the data that the bank has of your interactions with the bank. And if you think this sounds crazy, it's just become law in the European Union. Yeah. So let's not forget Ubuntu. Let's not forget the notion of the ideal of a co-created humanity, the shared responsibility of making each other. It is more profound than the spin doctrine around it. The idea that I am what I am because of who we are, because I define you and you define me, is a very, very deep philosophy, and I think it's extremely relevant to the world, and it espouses sharing. And obviously, it is the open source software product of our own homegrown Ubuntu. I'm going to stop there, but suffice to say that if I leave you with anything, it is to make the point that sharing is the natural habitat of abundance, and this is what we should be moving towards. Thank you very much.
setting up Jessica in the so we've got so Jason, we've got two questions, but we're kind of pressed for time, so I'm not sure if you want to answer now, or I could
I'm
email
here.
them.
I'll do whatever you guys want, except take the hat off.
Let's answer. So the first question is from Constance, and that is, do you have any recommended reading, especially for intro IA?
If somebody wants to kind of get a first exposure to it.
I think that, yeah, it sounds like it.
Read Pervasive Information Architecture. It is not the web design version, but it includes it. And it's by Resmini and Rolzati.
Okay.
I can, yeah, and let me know if you can't afford it. Another form of colonialization here. I mean, how much do books cost? An ebook costing $50, or downloading a research paper. It's just copy and paste, for goodness sake. And it's the same price. Yeah? Like we in South Africa have to pay the same prices as people in Europe and America, but it costs us 10 times more. And what does that do? That creates a scarcity of knowledge. The stuff that's going on, folks, is atrocious. And thank goodness America is waking up to it. We'll have to see about Europe, and we'll have to see if Trump gets voted in or not. Please carry on while I rant.
So the next, no, it's fine. It's fine. I think everybody's enjoying you stroking your hair frivolously. So the next question is, it's very similar. Any recommended reading into the influence of critical theory on IA or contrived ontologies?
So Terence, okay, so this theory of contrived ontology and all of that sort of stuff has only been written about by myself and Terence. The first publication that deals with it is called Design of Socially Sustainable Ontologies. You can, and it deals directly with those cultural issues and beyond them. So the whole point about the contrived ontology is that it is made visible, so we can pause and think about what that otherwise hidden content in design really is. So we can take those critical stances of LGBTQT, or the feminist stance, or a Marxist stance, etc., and we can build that into our work, and it forms the last third of that paper. And it's the paper actually I offer a screen grab of it in the first part of the presentation, and it was published in the Journal of Philosophy and Technology. It is expensive again, so go on to ResearchGate and you can download it for free from my kind of portfolio, my page or whatever, my area on the site, and it deals with that. The point, though, is not purely transformativist. The point is that understanding and observing contrived ontology is not just about change. It is about making the decision about sustainability or change. It's not, I really don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to making the world right. Marxism and communism is a great example. It was thrown out by the so-called most liberal, folks in the world, being Europe or England and America, and they threw away. Just because communism didn't work doesn't mean that sharing isn't right. So that means that we need to carry on being creative about thinking about how to institutionalize sharing. So yeah, that's the point. It's more like Hannah Arendt's point in the banality of evil. Let me not go into that, but look up Hannah Arendt. It's a similar point.
We don't have any more questions. I mean, if there are any more questions, I suggest that everyone maybe reach out to Jason. He's on Twitter, Hobbs, SAUX Forum on Facebook. Are you're still active on that, right, Jason? I mean, you still receive notifications via that. And then also ResearchGate.
Yeah, ResearchGate. But email me. I think. I mean, you guys have got my search. My email address. Please email me. Ask me stupid questions, clever questions, whatever. I love helping other people. Please.
Yeah.
I'm an open web page. And you can find that stuff here. But yeah, I do get notifications from the UX forum and from Twitter and stuff. I don't like social media anymore.
No, it's all good.
But try me, I'll be able to reply. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
And I'll put information on my website in the next day or two, and you guys can have access.
And we're also going to post these videos. But thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for concluding the talk. Always informative.